There is one issue from Justin Trudeau's first mandate that's perhaps done more damage than any other, the SNC-Lavalin controversy.
I take full responsibility. The buck stops with the Prime Minister.
It's shaken the very foundation of the Liberal government and called into question the judgment.
Justin Trudeau bullied, attempted to interfere, and then denied so blatantly.
The ethics and the integrity.
How do we know that he's not going to do this again? How can he be trusted?
Of a Prime Minister who's pledged 4 years ago he would do things differently. And there's already been a price to pay. 2 high-profile ministers lost their jobs. So did the Prime Minister's close friend and principal secretary. And this single event perhaps caused the most harm in public opinion polls.
We are facing a moment in a couple of months where Canadians get to make a choice about the kind of government that they want to see lead them.
So, with today's Ethics Commissioner's report, the question now, will all of this cost the Liberal government dearly come October? So let's get into it. Rosie is away, but we have called in a special summer edition of At Issue. And yes, I know it's not Thursday, but close enough. Chantal Hébert is in Montreal, Andrew Coyne in Toronto, and Chris Hall is in Ottawa tonight. Chantal, let's start with you. And just on the question of how damaging this all may be, I mean, to what extent does this hurt the Liberals come election time?
Well, come election time, I can't answer the question, but it is a damning report and one that singles out the Prime Minister for blame to the exclusion of others. Most of us, I think, didn't think it was possible to make Justin Trudeau's handling of this file look worse than Jody Wilson-Raybould had when she testified in front of a parliamentary committee. But the Ethics Commissioner managed to do just that. There are no great lines to salvage the Prime Minister's behavior in that report. So that is where the damage is. The saving graces, if there are some, I would say, is the earliest the better. So better this report today than in 2 weeks or in a month when the campaign is in full swing. It's easier to try to figure out how to control damage. And the other question is, if Canadians base their vote on this report, Justin Trudeau is in huge trouble. But I'm not convinced that that is what they will base their vote on, and that remains to be seen.
Right, and you raise an important issue, the very fact being that we are still 2 months plus away from E-Day. Andrew, I want to hear from you, but first let's hear from the Prime Minister himself. So in his own words, in his own defense.
This was a situation that shouldn't have happened. But my desire to protect Canadians and at the same time to protect the integrity and the independence of our judicial institutions remained throughout.
So, Andrew, he's trying to walk a line there, right? On the one hand, he's saying, look, I take responsibility, but then he's also saying, understand that all I really cared about at the end of the day, jobs. How effective is that position going to be?
Not terribly, I don't think, except to the hardcore partisan base, which may matter at this point. It's clear he doesn't really think he did anything particularly wrong, maybe, you know, looked improper or what have you, but still thinks his motives were good. In the Ethics Commissioner's report, he says that Trudeau's lawyers said he can't be held to account for any of this. It was all just people acting on his behalf, and he's not really directly responsible. So, yeah, I think it matters both because it's reviving the story, which did them enormous damage in the spring. You have a respected public servant with access to all the best legal advice and most of the evidence in this case, some of it still withheld from him, but more evidence than we've had to date, basically making a formal finding that Jody Wilson-Raybould was correct in all the major particulars on this. And you have some fairly damning details. I mean, whether or not this was a conflict of interest is frankly the least of my concerns. There is evidence here of how most of the government seemed to be taking its lead from SNC-Lavalin's lawyers, was working hand in glove with them, basically conspiring against their own Attorney General to get them off of criminal charges. That cries out for further explanation. I mean, these wild schemes to involve the former Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, Beverly McLaughlin, who appears to have declined, but I'd like to hear more from her about how far she entertained these frankly crazy notions. I think would be there's much more still to be learned about this.
Right, except, you know, I was trying to really listen to what Justin Trudeau was saying, but maybe more importantly, trying to listen to what he may have been telegraphing to Canadians. And I wondered if there was a strategic opportunity for him here in the sense that he was saying, look, this is proof of how much I care about jobs, that even when I don't think other people outside of my inner circle are watching, this is what I do, and look how much trouble I've gotten into because I care so much about jobs. Is there an opportunity there, Chris, do you think?
I would think that there would be a better opportunity if the Prime Minister's version of events hadn't changed so dramatically since February when this first came out. Remember, he said the story originally from the Globe and Mail was false. Then he said that no one had directed Jody Wilson-Raybould to do anything, which was never the allegation in the first place. And then he said she probably didn't take it the same way we had intended. So if the message today is that he accepts the report, then why does he disagree with most of the findings about his culpability in this and the fact that he needs to take responsibility? And in the end, if he's going to go to Canadians with a message that I care so much about jobs, there's a lot of evidence that's come out since that first argument that there weren't so many jobs at stake, that so many infrastructure projects are on the books here that the people who work for SNC-Lavalin would have found work with other contractors anyway. So it's a difficult argument, I think, to make given how inconsistent he's been on this over the past few months.
Chantal, sorry, go ahead, Andrew.
I think that's the larger issue. You know, people will say, are people going to base their votes on this particular issue? Maybe some will, maybe a lot won't. I think the more damage that's done in the long term from these kinds of things is the damage to the perception of the Prime Minister. And even after people have forgotten the particulars of a particular issue, they will remember that he looked dodgy, he didn't seem trustworthy. You know, these kinds of impressions have much more, I think, long-lasting and damaging effects on a party and on a leader.
Chantal?
True enough. The fact is, though, that there is a lot of public fatigue with this issue. It's gone on for a long time. There were not... I found the report really troubling, and the connection between SNC-Lavalin and the government basically operating as one troubling. But I'm not sure that that amounts to a huge revelation to many voters. And I suspect that most voters at this point had already made up their minds as to whether they felt Trudeau had really stepped into it over SNC-Lavalin or whether he'd just been trying to get to his job. So I'm curious to see in 2-3 weeks when the storm is blown over, where public opinion stands on this and whether it goes back to where it was yesterday.
Okay, so then let's try to get inside the minds of Jagmeet Singh and Andrew Scheer. You know, on the capacity for the opposition to run with the ball, federal NDP leader Jagmeet Singh framed Trudeau as working for Canada's wealthiest, not the everyman. Conservative leader Andrew Scheer said this.
Today's verdict is in, and it is a guilty verdict. Justin Trudeau is guilty again. Heading into this election, Trudeau has already become the only Prime Minister in Canadian history to have been found guilty of breaking ethics laws. Now, we know he's done it again.
Okay, Andrew, so we hear this word guilty, and clearly, I mean, the Ethics Commissioner's findings aren't taking place in a court of law, so it's not a guilty verdict as such that we're talking about, but Scheer is framing it that way, right?
Yeah, and I'm not sure that's necessarily his best play on this. I mean, the knock against Scheer is he's not particularly, doesn't have particularly a great deal of gravitas, that he tends to exploit the short-term opportunities at the expense of the long-term vision of the country and everything else. I would, rather than him going for the cheap applause line, to try to explain to Canadians why this matters, why prosecutorial independence is a serious thing, why messing around with the prosecution of a Liberal-connected company that is accused of pretty serious crimes should not be tolerated. Why these things are important principles, I think, would be not only in the interests of public education, would look a little more statesmanlike on his behalf than just the kind of, as I say, the cheap applause line.
Yeah, could I jump in there too? I was struck today by what should be an obvious warning signal for every political leader, that trust is not in great abundance right now. And if you're now saying that the guy who promised to be different 4 years ago really isn't any different, but you're going to be different if the Conservatives are elected, it's not a message I think most Canadians want to hear. Right,
and it was interesting because it took Andrew Scheer all of 2 minutes to pivot from trying to skewer Trudeau into saying, well, here, you know, the more pragmatic approach perhaps is the fact that, hey, I'm running too. I'm going to be in the election and I'm your guy. Chantal, you're kind of shaking your head, though.
Well, I thought both opposition leaders did not rise up to the occasion and could have done a lot more. And on this, I agree with Andrew that Andrew Scheer's point involved a lot of rehashing of Conservative lines over the past few months. And this was a grave occasion. Too bad for him that he squandered the Prime Minister should resign line too early, because reading this report, it does come to mind more than it did when he first asked for the resignation of the Prime Minister. As for Mr. Singh, he must have decided that he has no hopes in Quebec if he is going to go with the line that SNC-Lavalin is only about rich people. because in this province, that line will never work. People know who the people are who work for SNC-Lavalin, and they're not rich people who are friends of Justin Trudeau. So both sounded like they were reading their prepared lines. I understand that no one expected the report today, but if that is how they're all going to run campaigns, good luck, because the unexpected and how you handle it is usually when voters discover whether you have what it takes to get their vote.
Right, and so I mean, 2 months, until election time, that is a long time. So what is your sense then? Because I was going to ask what the Liberals would have to do to avoid this becoming a bigger problem than it already is. But I feel like the collective sense that I'm getting from all of you is that, well, maybe the problem sort of takes care of itself.
Well, I'm not saying that. Yeah, I'm not saying that. I think that the Liberals will obviously try to turn attention to other issues, healthcare, climate change, where they're obviously on firmer footing. But this whole thing about trust and the fact that Justin Trudeau was really 4 years ago the banner around which the Liberals rose from the ashes of being the third party in the House of Commons to being government. If that's been eroded in any significant way, as Andrew indicated earlier, that will be a very difficult sell everywhere in the country, I would argue, including Quebec.
I mean, this is a government, all governments heavily focus on their leader, on the Prime Minister. This is a government that more than most, certainly in the first 2 or 3 years of its mandate, was almost obsessively devoted to, putting the Prime Minister front and center in every photo op, et cetera. He is really damaged goods now, and this report is going to continue that. But I'll come back to something Chris was saying. If Andrew Scheer wants to take advantage of that, he has to convince people that he'd be something different. And something different is not just shouting guilty. Something different is displaying the maturity and the judgment and the wisdom and the integrity that you would act in a different way given the same set of circumstances. And that he's far from making that case.
And to build on that point, if this were a referendum on Justin Trudeau, not great. But this is a choice that people have to make, and the other options on offer have to look like they're significantly better, and not just on saying, well, I wouldn't do as badly as he did with SNC-Lavalin, but in the larger picture. And I would argue that today, no one actually won the day. It was a lost day, I think, for trust and for Canadians.
Okay, well, this was day one. Plenty more boxing to come, I suppose. Chantal Hébert, Andrew Coyne, Chris Hall, thank you very much.
Thanks, Senator.